Mr. Jaibal, thank you so much. Admiral Luthra, Ambassador Shingla, Ambassador Puri, Navdeep Suri, distinguished guests and friends. I'm indeed delighted to be here at the ORF and speak, and what an audience. Thank you so much. Now, we've heard of a whole lot of new alignments and opportunities that were unconceivable almost a decade ago, which have emerged in the last 3 years alongside the COVID. And many of the keynote speakers have mentioned that these geostrategic developments have allowed us to create, collaborate, and connect, not in that same order. And perhaps that is the reason why the theme of this seminar is so very apt. But many of you also recalled that the history of engagement between the Gulf and India has been over 5,000 years, so I won't repeat that. But what is important is somewhere down the line we've forgotten these connects, and therefore we have kind of lost out, and that's the normal refrain by many of the people who are here. What we are seeing change, I think, is a very clear, focused, visionary, dynamic leadership of our countries, which is looking at reviving these relationships, and overall aim being reviving the prosperity, growth, and greater good of the humankind of this area. A large number of accords have been signed. We've heard of the Abraham Accords. We've heard of the various I2U2 and other SEPA agreements, which have a whole plethora of range of activities which can happen in the future. So before I go on to my maritime domain, I think I would like to at least focus on some of the salients of the current scenario. COVID certainly is behind us, but the scars of the era will remain. There's no doubt in our mind. Besides loss of life, I think it's impacted all of us at the national and international levels in terms of our economies, in terms of our growth momentums, in terms of our people. But one thing which has clearly emerged is that cooperative mechanisms have helped us overcome this COVID. So therefore, there is no doubt that we will grow stronger if we tend to cooperate. The US forces have withdrawn from Afghanistan. It has once again created some amount of instability, some amount of anxiety, if I were to say, and it will take time to settle down. But what, really speaking, intrigues me is, we wonder, what has the 20 years of deployment done for the region? And that's a question we need to answer and ask ourselves. And there's some of the threats that came about, that external interests may just wean away at some point in time, they may withdraw. The ongoing special military operations by Russia in Ukraine as a landmark event, and it's already shaping a shift in geopolitics and geoeconomics. What is important is brought home the stark reality of state versus state conflict, that too long duration, and the kind of devastation it is going to cause to the humankind of those countries, we often tend to forget during peace. And it's also important to know that what poor leadership or indifferent leadership can cause to its people, because now it's maybe going to take 40, 50 years to rebuild that country, Ukraine, and maybe a few $100 billion to kind of recreate what existed a few years ago. From a diplomatic perspective, I think it's come out loud and clear. Everybody else in this conflict is a bystander. Each country has just looked after its own national interests. And therefore, future wars, you've got to protect your own, and there is no other doubt. It's led to disruption of the global supply chain, increase in gas prices, direct impact on energy and food security. Some of the countries in Europe are really struggling. We go across to the Indo-Pacific. There's a huge amount of saber rattling going on between China and Taiwan. This could disturb the status quo and may have a larger impact for the global scenario. Overall, one thing is for sure, as far as we are concerned, China has emerged as a more assertive and aggressive power anywhere. And they are trying to do grabbing anywhere that is possible, whether the South China Sea or the East China Sea, closer in the Himalayas, or even in the Indian Ocean region. The Chinese footprint in the maritime domain in our region has grown substantially. Besides their merchant ships, they have a huge number of fishing boats, very huge ones, and they've got warships, research ships, and a lot of other facilities coming up, be it the base in Djibouti or the kind of linkages that have been established under the CPEC in Gwadar or maybe BRI in Hambantota and places closer by. As I've said, on the positive side, I think there is rapprochement between Israel and several other countries in the Gulf, and the signing of the Abraham Accords is one of those significant steps, in my opinion. This is also perhaps largely a greater good for the mankind, because if conflicts can be reduced, I think we'll be a better place to live in. The ITU2, as has been brought out by the previous panel, I won't dwell on it more, but I think it's resulted in some thaw in the relationships between Israel and some countries in the Gulf. May not be totally on board, everybody may not be on board, but certainly it kind of has brought in some thaw. Despite the push towards environmental goals and sustainable development goals, prosperity in the region of the Gulf is primarily linked to petroleum age. And this will continue to be the lifeblood of modern society today and in the few decades ahead. The arteries and the lifelines on which this gas will flow or the oil will transit would certainly be the maritime sphere, or the sea routes, or the sea lanes of communications, as we in the white uniform call it. Of course, any disruption of these sea routes will have tremendous impact on both the energy security and economies of most nations in the region. It is maybe for this very reason that we see a large number of navies and maritime security forces deployed in the Gulf and in the Arabian Sea area under the garb of combined maritime forces, combined task forces, World Food Program, and you name it all, anti-piracy patrol, which are trying to bring peace and stability, so to say, in the region. As to the maritime domain in the Arabian Sea is concerned, for which we are here to discuss, I can say for sure that almost 95% of India's trade is driven through these seas. And as far as the world is concerned, it's about 80%. So anything that happens to these seas, any instability, any insecurity in these seas would certainly have an impact which will be global. And our maritime region is no different from any other place, slightly more insecure. And the insecurities include maritime terrorism, piracy, armed robbery, gun running, human and narcotics trafficking, and I think the latest kid on the block is the illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, which is the new menace. The recent trends on piracy and armed robbery incidents indicate that the threat is reducing considerably. But other threats of maritime terrorism and narcotics is taking a big leap. And I think that is the area of concern. While it is felt that non-traditional challenges such as these will ebb and flow in severity, but what is important to remember to this community is that they provide cyclical funding to sustain each other. So if we want to stop any one of them, we need to address all of them at a level where we are able to stop something. Illegal activities also fund and create opportunities for terrorism at sea. And the important part is that most decision makers remain unaware of this threat till it comes home. For us, 26 November 2008 was a reminder of the stark reality. And we are at one of the venues which was under attack at that point in time. Today, narco trafficking constitutes almost 50% of the contraband in the region. And our ships are taking regular patrols along with partner nations from the Makaran coast to Pakistan to Maldives. And contraband worth about narcotic contraband over hundreds of millions of dollars has been seized in the last few months and years. Of course, this is very important because it dries up the source of funding for most of the organization we do illegal work. What is the new thing is our ships have observed a large number of fishing vessels which operate just outside the EEZ. They are within the legal zones. They are outside the legal implications of Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, and many of these are extra-regional fishing boats. When we say boats, we have to take Indians have to take our minds off our fishing boats. These are ships are bigger than destroyers. They are that huge. They are processing platforms. They are supported by refrigerator ships which come all the way from Shanghai, pick up the catch from here and go back there. So while they are within the zones of law, certainly it is a cause of concern, and there is a need to review existing mechanisms of IOTC and all other frameworks. And I think this is most important because of the issues of food security that have just been brought out. Food, I think fish is a new protein that we need to harness, and a lot of effort is required on that count. And there could be large amount of cooperation on that field between India and GCC countries. Of course, addressing all these challenges will require a multi-layered mechanism for security between the GCC, Maritime Security Forces, the Indian Navy, and this can be achieved through greater cooperation, collaboration, and debate. Our Prime Minister has, in 2015, articulated a vision for the maritime domain when he said, we seek a future for the Indian Ocean that lives up to its name of Sagar. And Sagar stands for, in Hindi it means the oceans, otherwise the acronym stands for security and growth for all in the region. Last year also, at the UN Security Council, he laid out the 5 principles, which included readiness to collectively face natural disasters and threats created by non-state actors, preserving the maritime environment and resources, encouraging responsible maritime connectivity, removing barriers for maritime trade, and peaceful settlement of disputes. All in all, I must say that the Government of India initiatives are honest and sincere attempt to promote an environment of inclusive growth, security, and harmony in the region. Indian Navy is a proud flag bearer of many of these initiatives. Our initiative of sharing information in the maritime domain has been one of the low-hanging fruits. While some of the countries from the GCC have joined, I would strongly urge most of you to come and send your representatives in the IFCOR at Gurgaon. Overall, considering the vastness of the oceans, scope and scale of the challenges and maritime threats to our region, it is not feasible for any country to do it alone. And therefore, cooperation, I think, is the only way ahead, especially for us who are permanent stakeholders in this region. To summarize, I would say our partnership and cooperation have received a forward momentum due to the dynamic leadership and forward visionary-looking thought processes of our leaders. I think we need to build upon that. We have a common history, a shared vision, and a common passion for things, including cricket and football. Huge opportunities exist to create a blueprint for the Arabian Sea community, for India and the GCC, and this will allow us to find regional solutions to local problems. I will end with a quote. A good and strong Navy is not a provocation for war. It is the surest guarantee for peace. Finally, I would like to thank the ORF fraternity for giving me this opportunity and this platform to share our thoughts. Thank you, and Jai Hind.
Hello, everyone, and good morning. We have had a very interesting session earlier in the day where we were discussing a lot of, I think, geopolitical issues. But now we are in this panel to talk very specifically on the security aspects, as the panel is called Decoding the New Security Paradigm. Whether this is new or old, it is up to our panelists to decide, and of course for you to comment upon. But I think what we saw in the first panel and the discussion that almost energized the conversation was that despite talking of energy security, trade security, water security, it also culminated in some ways fundamentally on geopolitics. And I think one of the panelists suggested the geopolitical overhang, which was very visible. And I have a great panel to discuss some of the more important aspects of this security change, security shift. Vice Admiral Singh, Sultan Barakat, His Excellency Sheikh Al-Qasimi, Raji, and Mahjoub Zoheri to talk about a range of issues on focusing more on how the security landscape is evolving and perhaps its implications for India, for GCC, for Gulf more broadly. Vice Admiral, if I may start with you, because you laid out a roadmap in terms of India's vision on security and what in particular Indian Navy looks at it. I would want to start from this idea of Indo-Pacific, because as we know, for India, the Indo-Pacific starts from the eastern shores of Africa all the way to the Pacific, which is quite distinct from some of the other countries and their idea of the Indo-Pacific. And therefore, the Arabian Sea, the Indian Ocean is critical anchor for us in terms of our visualization of the maritime landscape. So when you're looking and when you are trying to understand or evaluate the changing nature of threats, do we see the larger geopolitical contestation among great powers shaping our understanding of what needs to be preserved, what needs to be contested, and what needs to be almost pushed back in some ways as the two major powers, as the two big powers, and as a global political order undergoes a transformation, which is quite fundamental in some ways, as many are arguing?
Thank you, Harsh. At the outset, I must say that I'm going to focus myself from a maritime view, having been a practitioner for almost 40 years. And second thing, I want to keep it focused on the Arabian Sea view and not go into the Pacific because that's where we are talking about. Now, as brought out earlier, any seas are to be seen as a means to connect and not to divide. Because from a land perspective, you start looking at it as the great void in between. So we need to clearly see the oceans as a means to connect. That is the first thing I would say. It also needs to enhance our economic security, our traditional security, enhance our environmental issues, and look at how we can progress further. So while looking at the overall Indo-Pacific, let's look at just the Arabian Sea perspective, we are talking of an area where I think in this zone, state versus state conflict is out. So if you look at it from a non-traditional security perspective, then we have a whole range of issues from where we can cooperate and we can benefit from each other. So that is one issue. The good part is that our leadership is focused on what we want to do. It's focused on the good of the people, it's good for the development, it's good for the economy, it's focused on that. And therefore, anything that we do must support that leadership view. So that's one issue. Second is, I think the opportunity to collaborate, and towards this, I think Make in India is a great opportunity for everybody to collaborate. I recently was in Qatar, and I was talking to the leadership there. They're going to buy a sailing ship, and they're looking at buying a ship, and I gave them this idea. If you buy a ship from India, rather than buying it across the Suez, it will be much more economical for you, it will be much better for you, it will bring in a lot of host of experience, which is from this region, integral to this region. So there is a huge opportunity in this Make in India program, that we are talking of Make in India, built for the region. Another place I would say is, we can come back to it later maybe, is also the fishing fleet. We discussed about the food security related issues in the previous session. I think that's a huge opportunity which is just knocking at our doorstep, which we just need to grab.
Mrs. Zoheri, if you may comment on what the Admiral was suggesting in terms of the defense engagement, GCC, India, Arab states and India. How do you look at the trajectory of that relationship? Traditionally, the Gulf countries have looked at the Western powers for largely their engagement. We have also seen China, for example, was mentioned in the last panel, expanding its footprint. At a time when a lot of the countries are worried about this major power contestation, polarization in international system, do you see an opportunity here where like-minded entities like GCC or India can collaborate more specifically on defense, which is going to be one of the most important drivers for the relationship?
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me first, I think what has been said so far, confirming that the collaboration should be there. We should keep the momentum. We should look at security as a must, as a need from all parties. Well, my perspective that we have to go beyond the security of what's so-called state security. We have to look at security in a comprehensive context. I think if we keep the discussion talking about security states, we are missing the point. There are other elements we need to consider if we want to achieve a comprehensive securities. Because the more states they focus on their own securities, the more others will be marginalized, the interest of nations, the engagement of nations, the capitalization of what the nation have, and in many aspects, cultural aspects, value aspects, all of this. And I feel that the discussion about security when it comes to Arabian Gulf, the focus is state to state, and basically you see that whenever there is a new element comes, the whole issue is basically becoming upside down. And this takes me to the point where, and the key word of all of the discussion is a collective security. No one can talk about the security of a specific country without looking at the other's security. I think the collective security, where we have to remember what happened in the Bab el-Mandeb with the piracy, affecting the whole Arabian Sea, affecting the Arab Gulf states, affecting Iran, affecting the trade when it comes to oil, to energy. So I think we have to look at and see how can we achieve this collective security, considering three facts. Number one, the emerging of non-state actors in the sea. And now, if you look at last 10, 15 years, you see what happened previously with the piracy phenomena, and then you have al-Houthi in Yemen, and thirdly, what was happened from militia in Iraq, and how those will affect the security in the Gulf. So the emerging of non-state actors in this picture has a great impact on security, and I think the countries should work together to find a solution for the emerging non-state actors who are becoming more trained to deal with the sea. Non-state actors before they're more active on the land. Now they are active on the sea. Number two, there is no way you can debate security without looking at what's happening in the world. There is level of uncertainty globally. This is happening in the United States. This is happening in Europe. This is happening in Asia, whether in China, and now what's happened now with Russia and Ukraine. That level of uncertainty is actually shadowing the situation, the stability and security of the Arabian Sea. And I think if we cannot manage how to handle those uncertainties, how can we transfer them from a challenge to opportunity, I think we will be facing real challenges. And the third point I think we need to consider seriously is, there are different nations who are basically engaged when it comes to the Arabian Sea. You have the Indians, you have the Iranians, you have the Arab Gulf states, and then you have the other side of the region. And then if there is no serious engagement, and I think I would refer to what my colleague Sultan said, if we don't go back to the roots, that roots is very simple, the value system. The value system we always believe in. I mean, that value system has introduced us to the world. If we don't go back to that value system and measure things based on human need, because if things kept to be discussed based on what politicians want, We are missing the direction. Absolutely, we're missing the direction. As the world now is missing the direction. If you see a leader like Putin comes and say, if I become upset, I will use a nuclear weapon, that means a lot. How many leaders, if he becomes upset, will use a nuclear weapon? We are in real danger politically. So if he doesn't have a good coffee, the world will go to the hell. Imagine how many leaders you will have. So we are living in a very dangerous time. I think we need to be rational. We need politicians who are more rational. And in the region here, we have to look at what's happening around us, considering all of those facts, and go to the basic. Basics can solve the problems. Bringing other players without considering the concerns of others may not bring stability, may not bring security. And we have a lot of evidence. Thank you.
Her Excellency, Sheikh Al-Qasimi, if I can ask you, and I think I'm following up on what was said, that ultimately the world is becoming a more dangerous place. There's a lot of uncertainty around, and for a lot of the countries, for a lot of smaller countries, for a lot of countries that look for stability as a fundamental benchmark of their economic progress or human prosperity, this is a challenging time. So what kind of collaborations are needed to manage that uncertainty? In particular, if you are talking about the issues that have been raised earlier in the panel today by the two participants earlier, in terms of human security, human needs, and regional security being built together, being brought together by the challenges of our times. How do you see this collaboration moving and evolving at a time when there is so much uncertainty and so much desirability for some kind of a constancy in the international environment, which is missing at the moment?
Well, of course, I mean, I will bring something Dr. Bahadur said in his previous session. We are in a very challenging region in the Middle East. We have plenty of instability factors, and it will remain that way, as he said. Unfortunately, we have to deal with this situation. When it comes to the security part of it, this region has been, there are so many actors involved in this region for a long time now. I mean, since the British in the region continue with the American. But if I come to the last point of time, since 2002, I remember when Bush was in the ship and he announced that this is the end of the war, and he declared that this region became safe, as he thought it will be. And the military doctrine at that time for the American troops that we will pivot to the east. This region doesn't need us anymore, and we will try to focus on the east. And the main focus for us will be China in the coming decades. But since 2003 until now, on the contrary, we saw more operations happening on the region, especially when it comes, since we are talking about the Arabian Sea, more about the marine security, which is a very crucial situation. And we see many needs for securing this route, not just for the country of the region, but because this is a passage for international trade. This is one of the most important routes for people to trade from east to west, from south to north. And we have two main choke points, which is Hormuz Strait and Bab el-Mandeb, as many of the marine here may know better than me. These are crucial points that need to be secured. What we saw in the region is that we have so many operations. We have, of course, the main operation, which is the CENTCOM, managed from the American base on Bahrain. The region itself has regional command. I think there are two, 150 and C-151. We have the NATO also operative there. We have the EU. Of course, the Indian Navy is there. Like-minded group, I think there is a coalition between Australia, Japan, and Canada, who decided that they will want to work separately. But of course, the Admiral will know better than me. Any military operation needs a command and need a hierarchy in its execution of its command. So if you don't have the mandate to do a certain operation, it's difficult to execute something beyond that mandate. The problem that we are facing in the recent years is that we start, as my previous colleague said correctly, is that non-state actors. And non-state actors in this region, until now, there is no specific command that are specifically targeting this operation. Unless it is, by its own country, if they are operating separately, not as a group. And in their own regional authority. Otherwise, especially for example, we see weapon smuggling to Yemen. It was executed by coincidence. It wasn't found because they were targeted by the operation there. But it was discovered by operation who are targeting actually piracy on Bab el-Mandeb. So, and here where I think there is very high importance in raising the awareness of regional cooperation, at least by exchanging information and exchanging of mandate to be able to track such activities. And it is not, not just weapon smuggling, but it can be human trafficking. There is drug trafficking, and as the Admiral mentioned earlier, also the non-legal fishery operations, which need to be addressed in a regional context because it is more important for the regional it needs regional involvement, and it will affect the region countries more than any other international community.
Thank you, Mr. Barakat. I think the point that was raised in this intervention was two very important points. One, if you look at this whole idea of US and US being the most important security guarantor in the region for a very long time, making an argument about pivoting to Indo-Pacific, or from our sense, this entire maritime space is Indo-Pacific, but more concretely to the Pacific. And other powers like China, for example, expanding the footprint. That means that there is a kind of a power transition also happening in the region. How does the region, whether it's the Arabian Gulf community or the GCC, manage that transition? Because I think the point that was also made was about institutions and frameworks not being available that can work in a collective manner. So when you have these two things, one, a power transition going on, and the other, the need for a multilateral or a regional arrangement that can map out the challenges of our times, that the void is quite stark. So how can GCC, or how can GCC in collaboration with other like-minded entities fill that vacuum at this time of great turbulence in the power hierarchy?
Great, thank you very much. If I'm allowed to start by just reminding everyone of what happened in terms of the US presence in the Gulf region in particular. It have winded down a little bit, first as they became less and less dependent on Gulf oil, directly the United States. Then they turned into exporters of oil, less and less interested in the Gulf. They may have still be interested in international trade, balance and price and so on, and that maybe maintains some contact. The second reduction, which we still haven't seen the result of, is killing bin Laden and then Zahrawi and withdrawing from Afghanistan. Now, the Central Command, I don't know if it's going to stay in the Gulf, because as the main reason why it came, the war on terror has now, in their mind, come to some kind of conclusion or may have shifted focus elsewhere. What is really, I think, challenging for us in the region is that we've always drawn our analysis based on where the Americans' interest is. And the Americans, of course, are very, very shrewd about their interests. You know, they are non-compromising. They will follow their interests regardless of any one country's direct interest in the region. And we saw this in the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I don't know if India was even consulted. They may have briefed India, but they have certainly not engaged they've not engaged with their NATO allies in a direct consultation about the withdrawal before taking the decision and before being determined to get out of Afghanistan. So I think we need to use that very always as a reality check of our expectation. The second, I think, the Arabian Sea, when you look at it, we often neglect the corners where there is genuine state fragility and whether we like it or not, continuous instability and source of trouble. Somalia is one, Yemen is the other. Closer home, you have Pakistan and Iran. If we are genuine about an Arabian dialogue, those countries have got to be part of that discussion, because if they're not included, they will always be out of the tent and causing the trouble for the rest. The Vice Admiral talk earlier reminded me of talk about the piracy of an incident that happened with me more than 20 years ago in Somalia, in Puntland, where we were investigating a source of income to the self-declared government. And the source of income said fishing fees, but none of them fished. And there were no fishing industry, really. And what we discovered is that they have been relying on Blackwaters and other independent security companies to train their soldiers, self-declared all, to go and stop the illegal fishing ships that were coming from as far as Portugal, Spain, and other parts of the world to come for the big tuna. It's a beautiful seas that is unexploited. They used to come and fish in those areas. These people will take the little boats, go and take over the ship, bring the captain and a few of his staff on land, do a sort of funny court, charge them the money, and then release them. And the world turned a blind eye to this for many, many, many years because, you know, there was a balance of trade. It's fine. The money they were paying was not a huge amount. It was illegal anyway, so everybody was getting away with something. Then it came back to haunt us when the same individuals and the next generation who was better trained with faster boats, machine guns, etc., were taking over oil tankers. And then, only then, it became a threat because it was oil tankers. Had they been going after the fish only, I don't think people would have worried. The upgrading to oil tankers is what made us all concerned. And I think we need to start by really doing our own analysis of our Arabian Sea and identify the threats. This is only one threat, what is going on in these ungovernable states. Nuclear threat. The race that is going on between Pakistan and Iran, the race to acquire nuclear energy in a very small spot about the Gulf, you know, so many countries. If an accident happens, let's not talk about actual bombing or anything, just accidents, which can happen. We saw it happening elsewhere. The Gulf is a confined area. It's a closed water. You know, we will all suffer. We don't have an analysis of what is the impact of the highest percentage of nuclearly powered ships and submarines that are now roaming our waters, whether it's United States, France, Britain, Russia, I don't know. But the concentration is amazing, and no one knows the impact on the environment of what's going on. We haven't done this analysis. And then I think, so the environment is also a greater threat. We need to look at it very, very carefully. I go back to the point I made earlier, to simply rely on counting weapons and traditional forms of security is not going to take us far. We need to consider all the countries around the Arabian Sea. We need to consider also the hinterland behind this, where people are reliant on what goes in the Arabian Sea, and see how best we can address it. And one area that is often missing in security is conflict resolution. We have lots of conflicts. We have no one place where people can address those issues in a secure, open-minded way. Doha recently grabbed the headlines by doing the Taliban-United States agreement and being successful in a few other places, but I don't think it's sufficient. And I think it has to be based on opportunity where a third party from the region can play a good role. I don't know what India is doing on the Iranian file, but that's an opportunity. India was very concerned about interfering in the Gulf states conflict during the Qatari, Saudi, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and so on. But maybe there should have been a more proactive way to try and see, after all, there are 9 million Indians living in the region who will be affected whatever happens to the region. So we need really to look at these issues differently. And based on each country and their threats, their opportunities, maybe a more collective agenda can grow. Two of the countries of the region, Iran and Qatar, are desperately reliant on the Hormuz Strait, because this is how they export their wealth. They don't have pipelines. This is the only way forward. And this explains why, for example, Qatar always is trying to stabilize, trying to avoid direct conflict, trying to work in the middle. And like that, I'm sure there are other opportunities. India must have opportunities direct in the region, beyond the region. That's got to be mapped first. And then based on that, we develop our security agenda. And it can be called the Arabian Sea Collective Security Agenda, or whatever it is. But it does not have to be driven by what the United States and the rest of the world feels their threat is. A few days ago, they've again announced Somalia as a threat to national security in the United States. But it's in our region. We don't know what is the direct link. They continue, somebody talked about the Central Command and others, they continue to operate drone attacks that totally undermines the legitimacy of the states in our region. Very little discussion goes around those issues. So I'll stop here, we'll come back later.
Thank you so much. And Raji, I think we have heard a number of issues. We started from maritime security, then human security, the great power politics, and of course this idea of how external actors impinge on the regional strategic architecture. So going forward, what are the avenues available for India and the GCC to coordinate on security aspects in the Arabian Sea? Because ultimately, I think most of our panelists are talking about that there is a need to do that, and there is a need specifically for actors like India and GCC to be doing more. And therefore, if you look at this maritime space, the Arabian Sea space, what kind of frameworks do you see where India and GCC can work together, and what issues? I think that might be an important intervention from what the others have said.
Thank you, Harsh. And I'm looking at the clock. It's like time is ticking. So let me come to the clear in terms of the ideas that we can take forward to build a closer collaborative agenda between India and the GCC. And I think some points have come out earlier, I think the earlier session or this session itself, in terms of the defense cooperation, joint production. And I think this is something that's come up even in the previous conversations, but we have to move away from ideas on paper to something more concrete, setting out the agenda in a sense. So one of the issues that came up even earlier in conversation is joint production of defense items, especially for naval and land systems in a sense. Is that something, so what is impeding? Make in India, Admiral talked about it, but I think Make in India is a great initiative, but I think it also means that India needs to step up its competitiveness because the capacity has to be strengthened. It's not that we don't have the capability to manufacture some of the systems, whether it is for land warfare or naval warfare, but how can we think about strengthening our own competitiveness, because we have seen huge delays in our own domestic manufacturing capacities required for our own forces. So if we are looking at making things for other countries, other partners, closer strategic partners, we also need to think about how we are going to increase our competitiveness that will end in a mutually beneficial kind of relationship. So that's number one, and I think that's an important agenda. But I think some of the other aspects that we need to think about, one is the emerging and critical technology areas. Again, there's a lot of talk about whether it is artificial intelligence, automation, quantum, cyber, and of course some of the older traditional areas like space, nuclear, all of these are happening. But at the same time, in some of the areas, traditional areas, there have been rules of engagement from the past, but I think those are also eroding in terms of the norms are eroding. Just to give you one example is the number of times now certain countries have been conducting an anti-satellite test. The norm to not create space debris, the norm to not interfere in other countries' space affairs, it's been broken. Now from since 2007, this has been repeatedly broken. The number of cyber interference or electronic warfare interference in space, in nuclear activities, again has seen a spike. Again, the norm to not disturb or damage other countries, other players' assets, civil or military assets, are again being broken. So we need to think about, and of course now we have more and new critical technologies coming about, and that's going to increase the questions around strategic stability and how this is going to happen. So one of the areas that we need to think about in more serious terms is the global governance measures. What are the kind of rules of the road that we need to develop for AI, automation, cyber, space, strengthening some of the older rules for older domains like space and so on and so forth. So can we start some conversations around this, norms of responsible behavior? Because I don't think we are at a space where we can look at legally binding measures, but at least as a starting baby step, can we look at developing norms of responsible behavior? What are the kind of, what's expected of, what's the good behavior that is expected of us, expected of my partners? What can we codify that in a sort of a document? Maybe you start in small minilateral groupings. And to that point, I think something that came up earlier also, I'm not sure we have a sort of a regional mechanism to deal with all of these issues. You have seen the difficulties that we face increasingly with the traditional regional security organizations and institutions. So and that's why there has been a mushrooming of minilateral groupings, whether it's I2, U2 have come up repeatedly in our conversations, but there are also other groups, and the most recent of which is the India, France, and the UAE. So there are going to be, and I would think that there will be many more such minilateral, trilaterals, such kind of groupings that might happen. And maybe these conversations need to be situated within these smaller groupings, build up the kind of some sort of a consensus before you take it to larger platforms, so that you are able to slowly build that step-by-step effort, support for some rules of the road to that everybody can engage on and everybody can agree on, in a sense. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much. Yes, very kindly. I've opened this up for your question. Yes, very briefly, sir.
Yeah, please. I just want to say two things. One is that we've seen the deployment of external powers to the Arabian Sea because there's lack of capacity, and therefore there is a need to build capacity. Now, while I agree that there is a need to build capacity, we cannot hyphenate it with the land forces because that's a different domain. So we need to clearly focus on small groupings. Okay, let's make this as a common win-win program. That's one issue. Second, I think there's a huge potential for just our food security, the protein segment of it. We can start fishing together at least, build ships for fishing, because it's going to impact human life at the end of it. And one thing that I want to say, which has not been touched about, is this, rising sea levels is something which is going to be upon us in a few years down the line. All of us are coastal countries. A large amount of infrastructure has been created close to the coast. And therefore, if we don't sit down together and kind of discuss these issues today, we have reports on Mumbai, we have reports on other cities, we need to look at these issues. And last is the maritime specialist domain, which is there. There's very little debate, dialogue, engagement, which is taking place. It's more on the theory level than at the execution level, finding solutions, finding programs, exactly what can be delivered in a short time frame. So kind of making a core group and working on that may be a good idea, in my opinion.
Yes, thank you so much. And that's the reason why so many practitioners are here today. Let me open this up for your questions, comments, observations. Yes, at the back, please.
Hi, this is Prashant here from the PTI. I have a couple of questions.
Prashant, just two.
Okay. So, one to the Admiral. So, you mentioned about the US retreating from Afghanistan, and you also spoke about our Navy seizing contraband. Do we see any correlation in the rise of the contrabands that are seized in a neighboring state? I mean, in Gujarat, the Coast Guard and the ATS is doing it. So, is there any link to that, sir?
And the second question?
And the second question to Raji. We have been seeing that how India and France are cooperating in the space domain, especially in the Indo-Pacific. Why can't we see any such initiative with the Arab nations, because it's so very closely linked geographically?
So we'll take a few. Please.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Ambika Vishwanath, Director of Kubernetes Initiative. I'm really glad that the Admiral brought up the rising sea level. And my question is to both the Admiral and then maybe somebody from one of the Gulf countries could answer about looking at cooperation of bringing a climate lens and a water security lens to some of these more traditional areas of security that we're talking about, because we cannot talk about maritime security, for example, going forward without looking at the climate threat to that. And then we cannot talk about food security if we don't discuss water security. And these are not areas of cooperation that exist in any sustained manner right now between the GCC countries and India, or in most countries in the world at this moment. So any ideas or comments on how we can put this into practice going forward, especially since we have a lot of practitioners, but also people from the research and the think tank space in this room today.
Yes. Just he's in.
Sorry.
Thank you. That's a short distance. Hello, my name is Nicholas. I'm currently a researcher at the University of Oxford, and I'm previously worked at USAID on Gulf and Arabian affairs, Gulf affairs, with focus on Yemen. And I guess my question is actually about the role of the United States in a lot of this conversation here. Obviously, I2U2 involves the United States as a core partner. There's all of the countries here that everybody here represents has very deep bilateral relationships with the US, and in fact, the US security architecture underpins a lot of regional security, maritime security, and upcoming defense agreements, including the F-14 deal, which is currently being inked with Pakistan, which obviously implicates a lot of other broader regional security concerns for India, as well as broader countries in the region. And I'm just curious about what your perspective is on the United States in engaging with emergent multilateral forums and minilateralism, and whether that's beneficial or actually counterproductive to the evolution of the new regional security architecture, especially in light of where it's going, vis-a-vis whether there might be a local, non-US led or in tandem with the US, a multipolar regional security architecture, and vis-a-vis that, what's the relationship of China, and where do you see that evolving over the coming decades?
So you are directing it to everyone. Nick?
Yeah, to everyone. It is a big question, so I apologize.
So we'll take one final question and then I'll give the floor to the panelists.
There's one here.
Yes. Can we have the mic here?
Morning, sir. I'm Captain Khurana from Navy, commanding a ship here. Just now, Mr. Sultan said that we had what started as a policing efforts of Somalia led to piracy, which we are kind of fighting it, though it has reduced significantly. And Admiral mentioned that there is a growing problem of IUU fishing. So we see that as a growing challenge in the Central Arabian Sea, fishing boats coming from far off, extra-regional. So that also is a sign of things to come. The number of boats is increasing every year. Are we looking at, sir, you would be interested like in a regulatory framework to address these challenges? Because Indian Ocean Tuna Commission does not address that for certain things, for all the states, littoral states in the Arabian Sea coming together. Or probably Ambassador, ma'am, you could answer that. Thank you.
So just to balance it between India and GCC, I think the last question here.
Yes, thank you. Enjoyed all the presentations. Thank you very much. I just want to throw some ideas, if you like. When we're talking about security in the region, what are we talking about? Whose security? And are we talking about regime security? Are we talking about state security? Are we talking about human security? Are we talking about Western power security? Who are we talking about? So I think this is something we need to dig deep into to understand who are we talking about there. So that's one thing. The other thing is the United States has been calling for burden sharing for a long time. It wants its own partners to burden share the security in the region. Well, let us be honest with ourselves. The United States has been a major source of insecurity in the region. Invaded Iraq. Look what happened. Withdraw from the JCPOA, created a problem with our neighbor Iran, and we are paying the cost of the United States' foolish policies in the region. Since Pax Americana, and we are here amongst friends and we're talking openly, since Pax Americana, when the Americans took over, how many conflicts happened in the region? Imagine. This is under what is known as the US security in the region. And we keep repeating that the US is actually providing security in the region. When the regional countries were attacked, where was the US? Regional securities installments were attacked. Where was the US? So that is another thing we need to think about. Another thing we need to take into consideration is that any security in the region has to come from regional countries, first and foremost. And we need a new security architecture that, of course, has international support, but it has to come from regional countries themselves. And that means a comprehensive security arrangement in the region. I know it is a pipe dream at the moment because we still have lots of conflicts, but we need to sort out our own problems within the region to be able to create a security architecture. India can play a very important role, of course, and it is a regional country, whether for good or for bad. It is our neighbor and can play a very important role, and we look for India to actually take a very important role in this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Raji, let me start with you and go like this so that we can, and if you can be brief.
Sure. No, I think one point I just want to quickly rebut is, of course, about the Middle East cannot remain immune to the great power politics. And I think that's a fundamental that we need to take. China used to be restricted to the Indo-Pacific, but they have expanded. They have bigger strategic ambitions, and they are going to the Middle East or everywhere else they are going to be going. And that brings it in direct competition with the US. And we may not be on the same page with the US on each and every issue, but I think there are increasing interests or strategic interests that are in convergence between, for instance, India and the US, whether it is, and primarily comes from the fact that we have to manage a more aggressive, belligerent China. And I'm not saying that US has to be the only security guarantor, and if they are asking for regional burden sharing approaches from the regional partners, it is because of a couple of different things. We can think about, leaving the United States, but the fact is that even if you let me take the case of Indo-Pacific. If you take China, India, Japan, Australia, even if you put together the naval capabilities or the broader military capabilities of all the three countries together, it is no match to China. The US power therefore makes a difference, and therefore the US is seen as a necessary power at this point of time. We may not be share the same perspective, share the same view on every issue, but it is, at the end of the day, just ask the question, is it in my national interest? Can I deal with China on my own? Can I deal with China through Russia? No, that's not going to be happening, and there are increasing fissures happening in that relationship. Can I manage China through some of the other partnerships? France, India, France alone. But again, we need a web of partnerships to manage China's belligerent and growing strategic goals and its belligerent aggressive behavior. Very quickly on the India-Gulf space cooperation, I think this is beginning to happen, but hasn't happened for a long time. India has launched couple of satellites now for the United Arab Emirates, but I think this is an area that is worth exploring further, that needs to happen on a much more sustained fashion. In the interest of time, let me stop there. Thank you.
On the U.S. Interest in the region, I said earlier that it has subsided, but of course the central piece remains Israel's security. And Israel's security will mean that the U.S. will always be in our region, whether we like it or not. They're going to be an influence. Should they be involved in the discussion that is around the Arabian Sea? I think yes, but not exclusively. A lot of our problems that we suddenly, we jump either this way or that way. Well, why not? US is important, but equally important, particularly important for you, China is, Russia is, and the EU is rising. So there should be an engagement of all these sort of polar powers, if you like, but not necessarily from the word go. I think we should do our own analysis first. We should identify our own targets, objectives, and then engage exactly as they would do about their interests. They will not come to India from the beginning and say, look, we're going to consider with you whether we should withdraw from Afghanistan or not, or we should do this or not. They'll come to you when it is convenient and when they think you can add value. And I think that should be a very important principle. In terms of burden sharing, I don't think they've made up their mind. I mean, they keep calling. Before Trump, they were looking to China to share the burden. Now they have a very different relationship with China. They want it to be as far as possible from the Gulf. And if you continue to wait for that, I think we will end up in a mess. So proactive thinking is really important at this stage. And just to go back to the issue of Somalia and the piracy, again, I mean, maybe the Admiral suggested fishing as a regional enterprise. Why not? We have suddenly gone off all the collective action. We've gone either in the hands of the private sector or the private sector locally or multinational companies internationally, and or small state assistant to state assistance. The problems we have in the region with these particular two countries, Yemen and Somalia, because of the failed state syndrome, they cannot represent their right internationally. Internationally, there are laws to govern all of this, but they go into a phase of 10 years, 20 years in the case of Somalia, where they are not able to defend or present the issue on any international table. And unfortunately, this is what happened with Iraq vis-a-vis water, and this is why they're suffering today. During the 20 years of isolation, blockade, war, Turkey built many dams on the Euphrates river that has led to drying up the water down the stream. Ethiopia is doing the same with Egypt in a time when Egypt was in a mess. So regionally, if we understand where the sources are, and I don't think there's lack of water regionally. I mean, here you probably have far too much of it. We have little, but you have the land, you have the labor to grow food, we have the stomachs to eat. All of this, we can do things collectively at the region. And if you look at it, it's not a huge distance, really. I mean, we're talking about the size maybe of the United States, I don't know, or the size of Europe. It's not an enormous distance to be able to get food across. And it's not a big call on us to adjust our habits. And I go back to Qatar in the 3 years of blockade in Qatar. They had to adjust, they adjusted. It wasn't impossible to address the pattern of consumer living, on electricity, on energy, on food, on water consumption, because they had to. And if we perceive this as a collective threat, we all have to, I think we can make the change.
Well, if I may address a few of the issues discussed.
Microphone.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Okay. To address a few of the point which was discussed, to start with about the U.S. dependency. Let's be practical also. All the GCC countries are dependent on the US security and will continue being that. Going down to the details of very technical issues that the radar system will not speak to other radar than the American radar. That's, I mean, a blank check, whether we like it or we don't like it. And it's something we'll continue on. Yes, there may be a little bit, rethinking of this relationship of that we don't want to be completely dependent on the US, but create other platform where we can have a little bit freedom of navigation. And that will bring us to the second point that I wanted to raise, is that creating a like-minded group. I think India would be one of the masters of creating non-alignment movements and then like-minded group when they form the alignment with Brazil and South Africa. Why don't we create, in a world of multipolarity, we thought that it will be more dependent, the issue would be more dependent on the area of interest than the geographical location or the geopolitical location. And here why we saw a certain idea like U2 is flourishing between these countries, because it doesn't have to be a geographical location in order to address certain interest and certain aspiration to solve a certain point of cooperation. One of the areas that, as mentioned before, we need a regional security mechanism where we can, it doesn't delete the previously operation in place and actively working, but it can address the areas where we lack coordination, like, for example, fishery, like, as I said before, it's the need of the region. And we will feel it more than any international commitment or mechanism. The last point that I wanted to raise also regarding the environment. I think there is a lot to be done in this area. It's completely new for us, at least in this region. Maybe it is there for a very, very long time in the Atlantic Ocean and the maybe North Pole, the Scandinavian were covering that point in their research. But for our region, I think there is a lot of work to be done. And I was going to address this point on the second session, so I don't want to say all that I have to say in this session. But there is an interesting point where environment could be one of the leading points that we can cooperate on, not just on the level of security, but also in economy and research and development.
Well, I think I want to go back to the key words I mentioned, which is basically collective security / comprehensive security. This is the key word. This is the secret. If the countries in the Arabian Sea manage to work together on achieving such thing or moving to that direction, that could be an achievement. There is a conflict just behind the door, which is about Iran. If there is no return to the deal, 2015 deal, there is a conflict coming. The conflict doesn't mean a war. If Iran kept like this under sanctions, you will have a fragile state, which will become more authoritarian, which will become source of instability, regional instability. So. And this is an important country when it comes to oil and energy. So basically, you have a bomb just behind the door. And that itself is a serious threat to the whole region. I mean, this includes India, Pakistan, Gulf region, and actually to the Middle East as a whole. I think the countries should wake up to that fact. The second point that I want to address as well in this context is what's happening in Europe now. Europe is coming to the region to get energy. To secure itself. And I think I have just to bring to your attention the fact that Europe was regret. Europe did not want to come. Europe was thinking that the crisis in Ukraine will finish in 1-2 months. They did not expect this to last until winter. They delay all their steps actually. And they used to lecture the world about plan B, you have to have a plan B. They did not have plan B. They panicked from the first 2 weeks. My friend Sultan said they panicked from 2 days. They start panicking from 2 days about winter. So they are panicking already. They are coming to the region now with very interesting discourse. They're coming to the region saying, human rights not an issue. We need energy because people, they are upset in our capitals and we are accountable to them. Give us energy, give us gas, give us RNG. We need to go back. Things are, very, very, very alarming. So I think these things also we need to consider them in this debate because Europe is coming to the region with different narrative, with different discourse. And this discourse, is it a short term? Is it a honeymoon? Or is actually we're lost? And I think this is another dimension. If you add it to the Americans withdraw from the region and actually observing all the region collapsing. And actually, just final sentence. If you want to understand what's happening in the Arabian Sea now, I'm a historian by thought. I really recommend you to go and read what was happening in this region, Arabian Sea, post First World War. Go and see what was happening by Great Britain at that time and see how things were actually similar. And I hope things will not lead to what led in the past. Thank you.
Very, very
Okay,
briefly,
I think your time has run out, so I'll just make 2 quick points. One is that most of the problems are not state-driven. Most of it is non-state actors, forces which are kind of driving this process. And next, I want to answer that question about narcotics trade. Yes, the trade has increased in quantum and in size post the US withdrawal. Much of the narcotics that is coming from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran. So they have to capitalize and make money on what they have, and that's what they are trying to do. Unfortunately, the receiving end is many countries of the region, which is not a very good thing. Thank you.
Let me thank all the panelists. And whenever you put security in the panel descriptor, it always creates all sorts of problems. But we have, I think, given the constraints, we have done very well, and we have taken more time than was given to us. So thank you all for joining us today for this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's